Welcome back to ESG Squared. We've had a little bit of a hiatus over the summer. I hope everyone's managed to rest up well. And we're glad to kick it off post-summer with Shin, who is head of climate change, of the HSBC Center of Excellence and global head of ESG research. Shin, perhaps we can start with a little introduction to yourself, because I'm sure you can do a better job than I can.
Thank you so much, Nicola. No, you got it spot on. A lot of compliance involved, but head of HSBC's Climate Change Center of Excellence and global head of ESG research. So what we do is try and analyze the multi-asset implications of climate change and various ESG issues for our institutional clients, as well as our internal stakeholders. So that's a lot of fun, and it's something that I've been very privileged to do here at HSBC.
Super. And we've had you come and speak to us earlier, and I was very, very impressed. So really glad to have you on board and on the show. So thanks a lot for joining us. So let me kick it off with our first question for you, which is the UN's climate science body, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released the first in a series of reports of its assessment cycle. And you have written your own report on this. And you mention in there that the Paris goals will be missed without deep and rapid emission cuts. Could you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Absolutely. So as you say, this is the first in a series of 3 reports on the climate science. And these usually come out every 6 or 7 years. It contains the latest climate change science. This one in particular is on the physical science basis. So if we just take a little step back, the Paris Agreement targets are to limit warming to 2 degrees or even better, 1.5 degrees. And that is for the mean global surface temperature. But on land, we're actually already up at 1.59 degrees Celsius. And the oceans have warmed by around 0.88. The question then becomes, how big will the overshoot be? Do we head to 1.6 degrees before coming back to 1.5 degrees? Or do we go beyond to 2 degrees before trying to come back down to 1.5 degrees, etc.? So the bigger the temperature overshoot, the harder and more expensive it becomes to fix. And more worryingly, that comes with bigger impacts. Now, this IPCC report describes where we're already at. Firstly, the human influence is unequivocal. That means there's nowhere to hide. We have to make changes. So those deep and rapid emissions cuts that you described, that's because atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide are really high. The point here is that the land and the oceans have been absorbing over half of our emissions, and they're struggling to do so at similar proportions. That means a higher proportion of what we put up there stays up there, and that matters for climate change because it is cumulative and not annual emissions that count. Everyone knows that the severity and frequency of extreme weather events will increase, but what is less well known is that this effect will become larger with every additional increment of warming, and that's not good. That's a multiplier effect, so to speak. So the physical, the economic, and the social damage could be very costly indeed. I'm often asked, can we take our way out of this with carbon dioxide removal technologies? Don't expect them to be a magic wand. What we need is a structural decarbonization of the economy, of energy and industrial processes, whilst at the same time working on carbon dioxide removal. So I would say what is required is for governments to set the policy framework for net zero emissions, for companies to implement this through changing the course of their business strategies within the next decade to 2030, and for investors and civil society to apply the pressure for them to do so.
Thanks for that. I mean, and you mentioned the overshoot, and I guess the overshoot is even more important because of tipping points or potential tipping points, which is presumably if we go beyond a certain area, you said it's harder to come back. It might even be impossible, presumably. And you've mentioned a lot of things that governments and others are doing to sort of help mitigate this. But what can we change? What behaviors can we as individuals do to help prevent this overshoot and help prevent going well beyond the Paris levels?
So I think there's a lot of things that we can do. Essentially, we need to change our behavior. And it's very, very difficult to change behavior at all parts of the economy. I mean, there's always politics, and that's complicated. There are always vested interests, and there are those involved in a high carbon economy at this stage. And then there are social development issues. So getting out of poverty, food security, land and deforestation and livelihoods, etc. So what I would say is that carbon pricing has a role to play here. Carbon pricing is designed to sort of capture the externalities of our emissions. So the health problems that we might have, the infrastructure damage, the crop yield changes, etc. So how can we envisage a scenario where we nudge behavior? I think there is a lot of support from leading economists, Nobel Prize winners, and otherwise, but this can only be done if the right incentives and behavior is there. So if I could just maybe go through the carbon pricing aspect of it, which I think is so important. Carbon taxes essentially charge for greenhouse gas emissions. If the price is too low, no one cares. So the emissions aren't meaningfully reduced. But if it's too high, everyone complains. And raising taxes is never a good thing to do politically. Maybe coming out of a pandemic is not the best time to do this either. Emissions trading is very interesting. When you set a boundary, you give it a cap, you give participants allowances, which are essentially the permission to emit carbon dioxide. These can work well if the number of allowances are appropriate, such that the supply and demand levels are where carbon prices are carefully considered. But also with each successive year, this cap gets smaller. So we're trying to encourage, I think, all participants to reduce their emissions organically. And we all have a part to play in that through the choices we make and through the frameworks and policies that governments and businesses and investors and financiers put in place.
As you say, some of these may or may not be that popular, but it's what's required often to help us all change our behavior. I mean, it would be great if we could do it without these incentives that you mentioned, but I don't think that's realistic. 2021 Climate Change Conference, COP26, is upon us. What should we expect from that? What is it all about?
Thank you, Nicola. Yes, crucial negotiations taking place in Glasgow very shortly, first 2 weeks of November. I mean, COP26 has been delayed by a year, and there are certain parts of it that have been unresolved for about 3 years. And that really matters because policy and action take time to implement. And in the cycle of the UN global climate process, many things were supposed to be resolved in what's known as the pre-2020 period. So it's supposed to have already happened, and it hasn't. Now, success at COP26, would mean an acceleration in the global climate policies that are somewhat coordinated. So you get more clarity on the visibility, not just on the direction of travel, but the speed of travel. Now, on the other hand, a failure at COP26, and you've just got ongoing uncertainty, disparate policies, and much less action in very many places where we're vulnerable to climate change. So there'll be a lot of discussion on, just to get technical, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. This is about the trading of emissions reductions, either bilaterally or through a global carbon mechanism. Agreeing Article 6 would be good for everyone because I think a lot of emerging markets, for example, would benefit from more climate mitigation and adaptation projects. This all leads to more investment from a climate change point of view. We'll also be hearing a lot about finance, specifically climate finance. This is loosely defined as the flow of finance from developed to developing economies for climate purposes. Now, we have a problem here, though. In 2009, so what's that, 12 years ago now, it was agreed that the number would be around 100 billion annually by 2020. Now, that didn't happen. And it matters because if the developed world can't keep their financial promises, why should the developing world make any promises, let alone keep any promises on climate change? So finance is often being used as a leverage or a negotiating tool. And this all has implications for our world at HSBC, the mobilization of private capital into climate change, etc. I think the policies and the speed of transition will be grossly affected by what happens at COP26.
And you mentioned finance, and obviously HSBC has come out with its own commitments around 750 billion to 1 trillion by 2030, and we have our own net zero commitments. We're trying to do our part, and hopefully we will. Shin, look, we've covered quite a lot, actually. We've covered a bit of the science behind it, some of the Paris Agreement levels that we're committed to. We've covered what we can do and how we can change behaviors. We've covered COP26. What else? What else should we be doing? Have we missed anything? Is there another major point that you'd like to cover with us?
I love these questions, Nicola, because in short, there's a lot more we could be doing, but it depends on whether you're a government, a business, or whatever. There's no single responsibility here. All parts of society and the economy must play a part. I mean, for governance, I've already mentioned they need to signal the direction of travel, put in those overarching frameworks for development to make sure that the speed of transition only increases and doesn't decrease. Businesses, I'll be asking them to consider climate change within their strategies and all their decisions. I mean, remember that climate change affects businesses, but at the same time, businesses affect the climate. For financiers, the financial sector and the financial system out there, advising clients on the longer term risks and opportunities helping them raise capital in a way that signals this change and accelerates the transition, but also embeds climate resilience. Investors, I'm always telling my clients to incorporate climate change and other ESG issues into your investment decisions. But there's a message for us all as individuals. Make small but conscious choices in our everyday lives. The things we buy, the food we eat, the transport we take. That's where I think one of the biggest differences can be made.
Brilliant. I think that's the right summary, which is it's up to all of us, right? This is our planet. This is our problem. It's a generational issue, and everyone has a part to play. So look, Shin, thank you so much for spending the time with us and for taking us through this very quick whistle-stop tour. But it was brilliant. I think we hit all the key points. So thanks a lot.
It's been a pleasure, Nicola. Thank you very much for having me.